Welcome back to the SABR Pod, the one-stop shop for hearing all about UTSCA's research and cool researchers. Thank you for joining us once again. My name is Lily.
And I'm Ren. Welcome.
Welcome. We had a really lovely conversation with a cardiologist on campus named Dr. Shreya Rao, we being Donese and I, which you will have the pleasure of listening to. It's really cool. It doesn't have the same biomolecular focus as some of our more recent episodes. She does a lot of research kind of in the social space.
More in the soft sciences, if you will.
Yeah, I think it's still hard clinical research, but looking at social determinants of health. And a lot of the discussion is just about how you find inspiration, how you keep going. It's really cool. I will introduce her more in depth just in the conversation. So, stay tuned and listen to what she has to say. Today we are with Dr. Shreya Rao. She's an assistant professor within the Cardiology Division of UT Health San Antonio. She earned her medical degree in MPH in Emory and then completed her residency and fellowship at UT Southwestern here in Texas. Her research interests revolve around characterizing the interplay between different social determinants of health, including race, socioeconomic disparities, and even zip codes, and cardiovascular disease, which we're thrilled to dive into today. So just to start off, you spoke with us recently, us being the MS1s, sort of about the broad field of looking at cardiovascular health from this lens, and then also about your particular focus kind of on the historical redlining and mapping that onto current zip codes, which we'll get to hopefully more in depth, but just from like a broad overview, for people who didn't get to attend that lecture, would you be able to kind of sum up the themes and kind of...
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for having me. And when I think about kind of my research work, it's spanned sort of three big themes, I think. The first area where I kind of started out doing this work was thinking a lot about race. To put this in context, I started doing my research more seriously in cardiology around 2019 and 2020. And so obviously this happened to be a big moment for race, but it really fit into this narrative I was kind of interested in already. And we started with this idea of trying to understand what weight race is lifting when we talk about it in science. And so we wanted to really disentangle the social aspects of race from what it means to have a genetic aspect, if there's a genetic aspect to racial designations, and then think about, based on that understanding, what work race does when we incorporate it into risk prediction algorithms and when we use it in our clinical care. So that was kind of one big area. The second big area that I was really interested in was kind of much more natural, actually, to me, and built off of my experience in public health, and was a very natural flow for me from doing an MPH, which was thinking about how social disparities are geographically distributed. And so we were very interested during my fellowship in looking at things like just how disparities in socioeconomic status and social determinants impacted cardiovascular outcomes, particularly things like heart failure risk, which tends to have much more of a cumulative risk that's built over the life course. And so we're very interested in these kind of themes of geographic disparities and their relationship with outcomes. And then this last phase of my career that's really been focused here in San Antonio as an assistant professor has been really kind of trying to build what I see doing over the next 10 and 15 years. And it's been a very, very different type of investigation, but really built out of the same themes. And so the idea with this most recent chapter has been to understand how we can look at new ways of measuring risk in any population that would help us understand how various exposures, whether they're social, whether they're health-related, how they result in not just cardiovascular disease, but in a variety of aging-related risk factors. We know that cardiovascular disease is just one aging-related outcome, but neurovascular diseases or neurodegenerative diseases are one, and chronic kidney disease is another major area of that. So we really want to understand how risk factors accumulate over people's life course and impact their ability to live long and healthy lives.
That's awesome. That sounds so daunting to be like taking into account everything accumulating like that, but it sounds Cool. That sounds
It's a lot of variables for sure.
It is. And you know what's cool about it has been this experience of kind of pivoting at each phase to something new. And what's been fun about this last phase is it's not anything I would have expected to be doing. If you had asked me 3 years ago or 5 years ago, I would not have thought of myself as an aging researcher. But the fun aspect of coming to science and working with new people who are doing things that you haven't done before is being able to then take a new perspective on a question you've already been asking. And so I've always been interested in this question of why are some people living longer and healthier lives than others, and how do we start to close that gap? But this is looking at it in the framework of aging just actually allows me to take a much broader view of that, both in terms of the exposures and in terms of the outcomes we look at. And so it's the same question, just asked a different way.
Yeah.
So you talk about you're working with, different researchers who do something a little bit different than you have before. And you're also looking at like neurovascular diseases and chronic kidney disease. Do you work a lot with other departments that have different specialties?
Yeah, definitely. So my early experience was very cardiology centric. I really seriously started in research as a fellow. I did a T32 dedicated research fellowship that was an added 2 years to my general cardiology fellowship. And I worked with a mentor who was a relatively early mid-career cardiologist himself, but extremely prolific. And so that was just an incredible, really sort of high yield time, but it was very cardiology centric. As I transitioned to my role here, I found that, building a career of my own or building a research lab of my own would require starting to get to know other departments, getting to know who else was doing work at this institution. And so I think similar to kind of how you guys talk about the origins of this podcast, I found myself kind of trying to figure out, well, what's happening at this institution that's interesting or that I can plug into, and how can I collaborate with people? And so for the first couple of years, I actually was sending a ton of cold emails to different investigators who I'd read an abstract of their work and say, that sounds interesting, and maybe it could apply to something I'm doing. And just tried to have a lot of meetings to get to know what people were working on and, how it could tie into what I wanted to build. And eventually that kind of led to a couple of really fruitful, relationships. One with Dr. Ramachandran, who is the Dean of the School of Public Health. And so he's been my primary mentor. And I do most of my work with him and in his lab over on the Greehey campus. And also with the Barshop Institute. So Dr. Elena Volpe is one of my mentors as well. And Tiffany Cortez is an endocrinologist at the Barshop Institute. I've worked with her, and they've been in this incredible support system for understanding how to execute a study, how to enroll patients, how to do all of the logistics, things that I hadn't really done before as a fellow. So it was this really cool experience of trying to find commonality with people who are doing very different things. But I think the result has been much more exciting and much more fun and felt much more authentic to what I want to do.
There's a couple of things that I'm thinking. One is that it's just really cool to hear how your perspective of what's going on in the world and also like your environment has shaped so much of the focus of what your research is. I think sometimes people think like research and science is kind of like its own objective box that doesn't get influenced from the outside, but you're talking about like the things that are happening in our like socio-political environment shaping your research in 2019, or like moving to San Antonio shaping how you're doing risk assessment and like outcome research now that you're here based off of kind of what you're seeing here. So I don't know if I have a question for that. It's a cool concept.
I think you're right. And I think all of us are a little bit different. I had a mentor once who told me this kind of line that I really believe, which is we all kind of come to science with slightly different objectives and skill sets, right? And there are people who come into it who are they love the scientific process. They like asking questions and finding answers. This mentor happened to be one of those people, right? I was never really that person. Yeah. And I think, he put it as I am a mission-oriented person. And I think that that's actually very true. I, from the beginning, saw science as a stepping stone to understanding a bigger issue that I care about. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the underlying sort of driving and motivating factor is this idea that I want to make healthcare and health better for people who don't have access to it. Doesn't matter what their skin color, ethnicity, language, whether they're rural or urban, whatever the disparity might be. I want to understand how we can make the health system more responsive to people who are not benefiting from it right now. And because I come at it from that aspect, I think it allows me to ask very different questions. And it doesn't mean that there have been times I've been very frustrated with the scientific process as a result, because the science is interesting to me, but not the end goal. And so I'm always trying to figure out how I can use the science better to advance, improving healthcare, rather than doing just science for the purpose of maybe kind of very agnostic discovery.
Right.
Which isn't to say that, the results are biased or I'm trying to find a specific answer, but more that I'm driven by a very specific type of question, I think. And so there's limitations to it. There's also, a lot of good that I think comes from that. And I think because of it, it's made me much more responsive to the environment I'm in, but also the larger sociopolitical context of the country, because the work is so tied into, what the states in which we live, and not the literal state, but the cultural and social moment in which we're living.
Yeah,
it's so inspiring how excited you are about your work.
Yeah.
I feel like, especially from people who are already established in their careers, you don't always see that like same spark that you did when they're like a pre-med or a medical student talking about like, oh, I want to improve healthcare. I want to make outcomes better for people. Do you want to talk about maybe some of the challenges that you've experienced and how you've dealt with that and still maintained your motivation for this field?
Yeah, definitely. No, you're absolutely right about that. And I think there are a lot of challenges. So I'll start by saying that, first of all, I wouldn't consider myself an established researcher. And some of that, I think, kind of always treating yourself a little bit as a work in progress and your career as a work in progress is something that both gives me comfort, but I think also it means that I'm much more open to possibilities of pivoting in some new way that's really different. And so I hope never to be fully established, but I think each stage has had its own challenges, right? So starting out in research, I don't think I was a typical research phenotype, right? I was at an institution where basic science was a really big deal. I knew a lot of people who were MD PhDs and were doing lab research, and that was the typical phenotype. There were people doing epidemiology work, but I'll say even going back before that, when I interviewed for cardiology fellowships, and I told people in my interviews that my goal was to be a cardiologist who worked on public health issues and who studied public health issues. There were institutions where I was told, that's not what cardiologists do. You should do infectious diseases instead. Or, you should think of a different subspecialty here. And so, at each stage I kind of faced people who maybe didn't think that this was the mold or the right direction to be taking a medical or research career as a cardiologist. But I also found a lot of people who were willing to support and very enthusiastic about it. I think the single most sort of motivating factor at each stage for me is I've always been able to find at least one person who genuinely was fully invested and sponsored my passion for it. And that made it easier to see, whatever obstacles or people who didn't necessarily agree with the vision that I had for my career, it made it easier to kind of see these as temporary things. And what I found, for example, as a fellow, was at times when maybe I had my own doubts about whether this was a viable long-term career for myself, or others expressed those doubts, was, well, once I started working on questions and I was able to kind of produce some results, a lot of those doubts internally and externally kind of went away. And so I started to gain a lot more confidence in myself and my ability to figure things out. I've never really seen myself as someone who has all of the skill sets I need to be successful, and I think that's something I'm still trying to develop. But I think if you start to gain some confidence in your own ability to figure it out, that if I don't know how to do something, I can find a way to learn how to do that thing, or I can find someone to work with who can teach me how to do this, it starts to become a little bit less daunting. And so that's always been helpful. when I came here, it was definitely really challenging for the first year and a half. And there were several points where I thought about maybe I've overcomplicated my life and maybe this isn't the path I should be taking. But again, there were a couple people who really kind of stood behind me and said, I think you can do this. Take your time, but I think you can do it. And just having a little bit of that mentorship, that support structure, made it more possible to kind of continue pushing through it. The other thing I'd say is I've always kind of functioned better when I felt like my back was against the wall.
Mm-hmm.
I remember hitting a point in about maybe like a year and a half into my job here. I was like pregnant with my second child. I was exhausted. I was working a lot of clinical time. And it just felt like I was kind of burned out. I didn't really have a lot of the excitement I wanted to have about my career. And I think I hit kind of rock bottom for myself when it came to my career prospects. And the weird thing was that it kind of freed me to feel like, well, if I was going to fail, I have failed really miserably already. So I may as well just start throwing stuff at the wall and see what happens. And weirdly, in that moment, I sent a slew of just cold emails to other researchers around the institution. I took meetings with people I didn't think would go anywhere, and some of them didn't. But I applied for things that I had no like reason to be applying for, or no reason to believe that I had was going to succeed at. But I just started throwing everything I could at the wall, and a couple of things stuck, and those couple of things built momentum to the next thing and the next thing. And a year later, I got K-12 funding, which helped me to buy out time to really focus on research. And it was, a night and day difference from where I had been a year before. And so it was weird that sometimes those challenges kind of free you up to think more openly about what you're doing, but also maybe not limit yourself so much about having this narrow vision of the one way things should go. The advice I'd give others is really just constantly trying to remind yourself what the purpose, like what you were trying to achieve when you even set out to do this thing. And if your goals and your values have changed over time, being okay with that too. Mm-hmm. And it's okay to let go of things that are not, exciting or fun for you anymore.
Yeah. That's really encouraging, that kind of feeling like, oh, it's okay to let go of this thing that I have been stuck on because maybe there is a better path and maybe I've kind of lost sight of my original motivation and goal.
Yeah, definitely. And I should say it's something I still talk to myself about, is this the only way to get to what I want to do? And something that I've recently thought a lot about is, we often, I think, in medicine think of our careers pretty narrowly. We're clinicians and we're researchers, or we're a little bit of both. But you have a set of tools, you have a skill set when you finish medical school that is really unique and really coveted in the world. And you can think really creatively about different ways to utilize that skill set. One of the people that really inspired me to become a doctor at all, because I had no intention of becoming a doctor initially. I had read Paul Farmer's book. I'd gotten really into this idea of physicians as public health sort of ambassadors in the world. And more so than Paul Farmer, though he's an incredible human in his own right, his partner, Jim Kim, who was, I think at the time that I was reading this book, the dean of Brown Medical School, don't quote me on that, but he had given this commencement speech, and he talks a lot about this notion of medicine as a tool to achieving a social end, that you walk out with a skill set, and you shouldn't see it as an end product, but a skill set that you can then use toward any number of goals. And so I've really started to kind of come back to that thought because it was one of the most inspiring things to me initially about medicine, and try to think about what skill sets do I have and how can I wield those skill sets, whether it's through clinical work, whether it's through research, or whether it's through a completely new avenue that I haven't yet thought about to achieve a social ends or this sort of broad idea of making the world a better place that we all kind of fundamentally get attracted to when we go into medicine.
I think a lot of the focus when it comes to what you're acquiring from medical school is the knowledge. Drinking from a fire hose is the like trite
Yeah.
metaphor, right? And then also just like the clinical skill set. But it seems like you're alluding to a different skill set that people don't really put as much emphasis on, in terms of like how you're able to relate to people, how you're able to see the world in a way that's different and can be such a useful perspective in investigating things or like making change like you're trying to do. So like in addition to that, I'm thinking both broadly in that thematic way, but also like logistically, what are some of the skills that you've found most valuable that you've acquired in more your formal curriculum, but also maybe things that you've had to learn along the way that you alluded to before?
Yeah. So I think from a medicine standpoint, that skill that you gain right in the clinical universe, that skill you gain of being able to talk to people, work through a problem, see patterns, right? This is a really unique skill set. And something I'm reminded of often, because I imagine like a lot of medical students here, right? Many of my friends who didn't do medicine, they go on to live lives where they have plenty of value, but they don't necessarily come across people of different walks of lives, of different, anything than themselves. You increasingly in most people's career, you end up gravitating to people who are doing the same thing as you, who think like you, who see the world like you. And medicine is a really unique space where that's not actually true. Maybe it's true with your colleagues to some degree, but we all spend a good chunk of our career and our time with people that maybe live lives that are nothing like our own. And that's a really unique thing. So that ability to talk to people, to see people's stories, to actually touch the world in a really kind of tangible sense, I think is something completely unique and gives us all a really different perspective on the world than I think other highly educated fields have. When it comes to the research piece, or just sort of the general academic aspects of medicine, the scientific process, right? This understanding of how to not just ask questions that are interesting, but how to then answer those questions, right? What's the best way to capture data? And it doesn't need to be literal, not the logistics of capturing data, but what does it mean when you have a question to then set about in a systematic way to try to answer that question? How do you do so without bias? How do you address bias in what you're trying to answer? And then how do you take that information, implement it, and study the effects of the implementation process? Right? These are skill sets that you could apply in healthcare, but you could apply in really any industry at all. So I think the scientific thinking process is something that's a really fundamental skill set that underlies everything you're learning in medical school and in residency and so on. But it's something we kind of undervalue sometimes in terms of what we're cognizant of our learning.
Yeah.
You were talking a little bit about how you feel like being in medicine and interacting with all sorts of people from all walks of life really changes your view of the world. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about what that's meant to you throughout your career? Like, how has your view of healthcare changed in this process?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'm going to give you an unnecessarily long-winded answer to this because
that's fine. This is your interview, your time.
Yeah, so I asked myself a lot lately how I came into this, and I don't really know why. So I'm a first-generation immigrant. I grew up with a really sheltered and privileged life, but one thing I kind of knew from a very young age. My family back in India, on both sides of my family, oddly enough, despite having completely different careers, half of the family in medicine, half in law, had this very unique experience, my grandparents, of being extremely community-oriented, very engaged with betterment of their surroundings, of the people that lived around them. And over the years, talked to my grandfathers a lot about their work doing this type of stuff in India. And one of the themes that came out, for one side of the family, there was a religious aspect to that, this feeling of kind of religious, trying to serve the community as part of his religious devotion. On the other side, there was this very political concept, right? This grandfather had lived through Indian independence and really saw part of his mission in life to be building this better community that he had believed in, right, in his own country. And I think I always found that so incredibly inspiring and fascinating, and this idea of community building, of being invested in the betterment of society, whether you take a really broad view of that or a really narrow view of that. I found that really appealing, I think, from a really young age. And I knew in a very vague sense from a very early age that I wanted to do that in some form. And I just had no idea what form it would take. And when I came out of college, I was completely confused. The things that I knew I was good at was writing. I was actually an English major. I loved writing. I liked journalism. I thought I was going to be a journalist for some time. And I liked talking about issues. I liked to public speak. I liked to do things that I felt like could move the needle on the issues I cared about in a persuasive way, right? And I tried thinking of different ways to kind of take that, and then started reading public health literature and started finding that really appealing. And said, well, these people are kind of speaking a language that makes a lot of sense to me. And so wound up in public health school sometime later and loved that, and then wound up in medical school. And so it became this really weird, windy path to becoming a physician. But what I think I was always kind of drawn to because of that path was the human aspects, the sort of social change aspects of being a physician or being in any of these roles. And so I remember consciously choosing where I went to medical school, where I went to residency, where I came to work based on whether there was a county hospital, what the local community was, to what extent that health system served the local community as opposed to serving maybe a fraction of that population, which is true of most health institutions. And it was really important to me that I trained and worked in places where I would meet people and take care of people who didn't have the privilege I had. And it really came from that sense of, well, I did this, I am doing this because I care about this concept of, social contribution, of doing something to better the community in which I'm living. And so, I think there are times in which that's been, a shock to the system. So I remember one of my first experiences in research, living in Atlanta as a public health student, I got this internship working on a study that was focused on behavioral intervention to improve adherence to heart therapy among HIV positive, homeless crack cocaine users in Atlanta. And a big part of my job was riding around in the van with one of our community workers and finding our unhoused patients. And we would know where most of them kind of tended to stay, and we'd find them, we'd bring them in for their study visit, we'd do their behavioral intervention, we'd make sure they got their therapy. But it was incredible. I mean, it was something at that age, right, being just out of college, really not having a lot of exposure to this community. It's something I had never seen before, and it was really new to me to see how to connect with patients who had completely different life stories than my own. But I think the piece of it that really stuck with me was the sense that it wasn't as different as I thought it would be. The circumstances on paper sounded really different, but when I was one-to-one with a person, I was just talking to another person. And that was really kind of profound for me. And I kind of saw that repeated at every stage of training, taking care of people who had completely different life circumstances. But I could always find, and it was really important to me, and is still really important to me, to find what we do have in common, because there's always something, that we can share or that we can relate on. And I really try to do that in my clinic too with patients. So I think for me, it was this idea of recognizing that, while these communities, while all of our circumstances might make our lives seem really different, or we might end up in really different scenarios, there's something kind of fundamentally human in medicine, and that's always been the joy for me. And so trying to kind of come back to that and find the commonality with patients or coworkers or whatever it is.
One thing I really liked about y'all's conversation with Dr. Rao was the, kind of way that she spoke about medicine as a human endeavor, a deeply human endeavor, more so than just a rigid scientific one. I thought her perspective there was really meaningful.
Absolutely. And especially drawing on just the experiences, like not only her own experiences at Emory, but also her family's background. I thought the whole discussion was really cool. I think part of that also comes from her background being an English major, which, we had to cut it for time a little bit, but
she has this writing background and like a previous dream of being a writer that she kind of touches on. And I think that lends a really cool perspective in terms of how you see medicine being able to help you serve other people.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Actually, we will dive back into the discussion, but that talk about the humanism of medicine and people's experiences and how they lead to the choices that we make led us to ask her kind of what drew her to cardiology. And she was, to sum it up, saying that she really liked the systems aspect, the fact that there's not as much memorization. It's just kind of like one hemodynamic system that if you understand the logic of, that a lot of the problems just stem from that. She talks a little bit about capstone projects she did for her 4th year in infectious disease. And then that gave her a lot of insight into the future of medicine and helped her solidify why cardiology was for her. So I'll let her put the next part in her own words, but that's kind of the background of what she's talking about.
The public health catastrophe of the last century was infectious disease, but the public health catastrophe that's coming at us really quickly is chronic disease, and particularly cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And so I started to think of myself as, well, if what I want to be is a public health physician of the future, then maybe I shouldn't be looking backward. I should be looking kind of forward at what's coming at the country and the world. And that's kind of where I started to get this idea of, well, I happen to like this field, and this might actually be a really different and fun platform to be talking about public health. And at the time, not a lot of people were doing that, but it turns out lots of other people had the same idea I did. And, by the time I was coming through fellowship, it had really kind of exploded as an area. People focused not just on health disparities, but kind of broadly on chronic disease and cardiovascular disease as a public health emergency. And so I got to kind of come of age in this really, fitting time frame for public health and chronic disease management.
It's awesome to hear how that timing worked out perfectly, that you can enter this burgeoning field as a researcher.
It sounds better than it feels because there were plenty of times coming into it that, and still now, right, where that also means when something's relatively new that finding mentorship is tricky. And so finding mentors, I had plenty of people I looked up to who were like, we support you, but we don't really do this. So we're happy to help a little, but we don't really know how to build this career you're envisioning. And so that was always really challenging for me, and something I think I've kind of figured out a little bit. I wouldn't even finish that sentence by saying I figured it out. Maybe I'm figuring out as I go, is kind of learning this skill set of not trying to have one perfectly fit mentor, because this particular field, or anytime I think you're in a new space or a developing space, the good news is that probably means you're doing the right thing, because this is something that it's something worth pursuing. The bad news is it means that you're probably not going to have a perfect example for what your career should look like or the steps you should take to be successful, right? And nobody's going to be able to answer those questions. So instead, I've tried to kind of piece together mentorship and try to understand what different mentors are maybe giving me. And so some might be really great at teaching me how to run and conduct a study. Others might be really good at helping me see the big picture. And so understanding that sometimes it means that you don't have the best examples to follow, or the easiest examples, I should say, to follow. But it still kind of can be done if you can learn what's helpful from different people.
Right. Yeah. And also it's kind of like the writing thing where it takes a certain amount of courage to go out into something like a blank page, or a sort of expansive research field that hasn't been tapped into, and know that you have to do something new.
Courage, foolishness, a lot of different words for it, but it's,
it's a balance.
All a balance, yes, all a balance.
And she's so right. It really is all a balance.
Truly. I mean, isn't that life? Just a balance of something or other.
I mean, foolishness and courage, sleeping and not sleeping,
life and
which
death.
Is, a little bit of a spoiler for the next pod episode.
True.
That'll be fun. You'll see that. But just to end off this one, I thought that was a lovely discussion. I left like feeling so inspired about medicine, about what my role could be as a doctor or a researcher. So,
Yeah, it was super cool to hear her perspective. Yeah.
I hope y'all felt inspired as well. Thank you for tuning into this episode. We would love to have you back again next week, so be sure to subscribe and leave us a review if you feel so inclined, or if you felt super inspired and you want to, put it publicly out there that Dr. Rao is amazing and should consider a dual career in public speaking or something of that nature, because
for sure, put it out there.
I would support that.
And if you have the opposite opinion, don't tell us. We
don't say that at all. Yeah,
don't say that at all. Yeah.
Keep that one to yourself. But if you have any questions, email us at sabr.podcast.outreach@gmail.com, or you can find us on Instagram at SABR Podcast. And until next time, I've been Lily.
And I've been Ren.
And stay tuned for more inspiring research stories.
Yeehaw.
See ya.
Bye.
Yeehaw is great.